In this case, in this particular circumstance, it has 4 windows. The quad box is contextual. That means the options in it change depending on what you have selected. So if you have a spline selected and you right click, it'll bring up a quad box which is specific to splines. If you're working in sub-object mode and you're working with a bunch of vertices and you right click, it'll bring up commands which are specific to vertices and so forth. So it's a very powerful feature which allows you to work exactly with the functionality that you're dealing with at that particular time in Max. Another thing that makes it very powerful is it's also keyboard specific. So it can be toggled with the 3 main toggle keys, that is Control, Shift and Alt. So if I do a right click, you can see it's bringing up one type of quad box. If I do that again whilst pressing Alt, it'll bring up another type. Control, it brings up another one again, and Shift, there you are, another quad box. So again, in each circumstance, depending on what keyboard toggle you're using, you'll get a different quad box. So a very flexible menuing system there, and something which I use, a great deal. Having just used the quad box, let's use that now to have a look at object properties. So we'll just select an object here, right click on it, brings up a quad box, and you can see here it's got the option for properties. So we'll just click on that and it's brought up the object property window. The object property window is used to store various properties of objects, which is pretty obvious really. Now, what are those properties? Well, you can see over here you've got rendering control. Here you can see, is an object renderable? Is it, will it inherit the visibility of its parent? Is it visible to a camera? What does that mean? Well, an object, when it's rendered in a lot of ray tracing systems, it can actually not be visible to a camera, but it can be visible to reflections. And in other software, that's also called primary and secondary visibility, i.e. primary is can you see it with your eye, and secondary visibility is can you see it in a reflection. So as an example, something that you could do with a vampire, if you're doing a scene which uses ray tracing, is you could turn on visible to camera, i.e. you can see the vampire, but you would turn off visible to reflection and refraction, which would mean that the vampire would not reflect in any ray trace surfaces. Vampires don't appear in mirrors. Well, you can do the same thing in 3D. You can actually get objects to appear exactly where you want them to in a scene. Now, that may seem like a very tenuous thing to do, but it's actually used a great deal. Let's say when you're rendering, the setup and the detail in that vampire model is extremely detailed, and you really can't get it to render with everything else in the scene. Well, what you can do is you can set up everything else in the scene to not render, just render the vampire. And then when you're finished with the vampire, you could set it up so you just render everything else, and then you have well, actually vampire isn't such a good example because the vampire wouldn't appear any reflections. So let's say you have the vampire hunter, and you turn on he's not visible to camera, but he is visible to reflections. And then when you render the scene, neither the vampire or the vampire hunter is actually visible in the scene, but you can actually see them in reflections. And then you can actually composite those two elements together in whatever compositing package that it is. And you've got total control over each element as well. If the vampire is not green enough or whatever, you can just color correct him in isolation. So you've got these various options here for working with rendering. Over here you've got viewport display options. Is the object see-through in the viewport? Does it display as a box? Backface culling on, lots of different options there. You've got interactivity options here. Is it hidden? Is it frozen? Over here you've got the options for motion blur. What type of motion blur will the object use? Is it on or all? Is it enabled? If it is enabled, is it object motion blur or image motion blur? And this actually can change as well. Different renderers have different methods for doing motion blur. So for those renderers, probably the only real relevant option is enabled, unless of course they use these other two flags, but use them in its own particular way. Up here you have the name of the teapot. You can change that here, and it shows the dimensions of the teapot and how many vertices it has, how many faces it has. So that's quite useful there for checking out the size of the object and so forth. It tells you the parent of the object, what material it's using, how many children it has, is it in a group or an assembly, and what layer it's on. So, you know, you can also change the wireframe color there. So lots of different properties there. In advanced lighting, if you're using, as an example, radiosity, you can set up various options here. So this is used with the radiosity system for Macs. Here you have a very similar thing for mental ray. You can set up whether an object will actually generate caustics, receive caustics, various things there, which are specific to mental ray. And then you have user-defined properties. This is actually quite a useful thing. What this allows you to do is to actually create, as an example, a little text label which you can put into this area here. And then you could use a script to actually check for that script label and use that to do something to the object. So it's basically a storage area for any sort of properties that are custom to your particular setup. So there you go, that's object properties.